When I moved into a peaceful suburban neighborhood, I thought I'd found my dream home, a quiet retreat with enough space to build a modest barn for my hobby of woodworking and occasional animal care. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place to relax and pursue my passions. For months, I enjoyed my secluded backyard and the barn I'd poured my time and energy into building. I had no reason to believe anything was amiss, until one fateful afternoon. I was working inside the barn when a sharp knock on my door startled me. I opened it to find a stern-looking man in a dark blue uniform with a badge that read, HOA Enforcement. He was holding a clipboard and didn't waste a second before announcing that my barn violated HOA regulations. Confused, I told him I wasn't part of an HOA and had never signed any agreement to join one. His response was curt. "You're within HOA boundaries, and your barn doesn't comply with community standards. You have 30 days to bring it up to code or face legal consequences." I was baffled. I had built the barn on my private property and had no idea the HOA had any jurisdiction over me. The man's tone grew more aggressive as he detailed a list of violations. The barn's size exceeded HOA limits, it wasn't registered, and it didn't adhere to their architectural guidelines. Frustrated, I slammed the door on him, assuming it was all a mistake or scam. But the next morning, an official-looking letter arrived on my doorstep confirming everything the HOA officer had said. The letter demanded I register the barn, meet specific regulations, and pay a fine. It also threatened further legal action if I didn't comply. Alarmed, I contacted the real estate agent who sold me the house, only to discover buried in the fine print of my purchase agreement a mention of the HOA, something I had completely overlooked. I realized I was dealing with a powerful organization that had far-reaching control over the neighborhood. Their rules weren't just about aesthetics. They dictated everything from landscaping to the type of vehicles allowed in driveways. As the days went on, I received more letters, each one escalating in tone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. Determined to stand my ground, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. I hoped to explain my situation and reason with them, but the board was dismissive and unyielding. They claimed the barn was a community liability and a violation of property values. When I mentioned I hadn't been properly informed of the rules, the board president shrugged, saying, "These are the rules. You should have done your research." The meeting ended with more threats. As I left, another HOA officer handed me a notice warning that non-compliance could lead to fines, legal action, and even the forced removal of the barn. The tension escalated further when I noticed HOA patrol cars frequently parked near my house, taking photos of my property and leaving additional warnings. The situation felt absurd and invasive. A particularly chilling moment came when another letter arrived, threatening enforcement measures and mentioning possible criminal charges for ignoring their orders. This wasn't just about a barn anymore, it was a power play. I knew I needed professional help to fight back, so I consulted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. My lawyer uncovered significant flaws in the HOA's process. While their rules were legally binding, the way they had notified me about the barn violations was improper. Armed with this information, we filed a formal complaint and prepared to challenge the HOA in court. Meanwhile, the intimidation tactics continued: more patrol cars, more letters, and even a warning that they might call the cops on me for defiance. The turning point came when I confronted the HOA board with my lawyer by my side. Their smug confidence faltered as we presented evidence of their procedural failures and heavy-handed enforcement tactics. The tension in the room was palpable, but they refused to back down, warning that they could escalate the matter if I didn't comply. I knew the fight wasn't over, but I was ready to see it through. My barn represented more than just a building. It was a symbol of my independence and right to live on my property without unnecessary interference. What started as a minor dispute had turned into a battle for my home and peace of mind. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was determined not to let the HOA win. The pressure from the HOA escalated in the days following the meeting. I expected them to back off after my lawyer's formal complaint, but instead they doubled down. Patrol cars began appearing more frequently near my property, their officers watching my barn like hawks. My mailbox became a daily source of frustration, overflowing with letters demanding compliance, threatening higher fines, and now including detailed invoices for penalties that had never been discussed. One morning, I walked outside to find a notice pinned to my barn door. The bright red paper announced that my barn was officially condemned by the HOA and subject to removal. I stared at the notice in disbelief. Condemned? My barn wasn't just structurally sound, it was a labor of love, built with my own hands and care. I couldn't believe how far they were willing to go. Later that day, my lawyer called with some unexpected news. He'd done some digging and discovered that the HOA had recently passed new bylaws regarding structures on properties, including barns, garages, and sheds. These new rules were unusually strict and had been passed without notifying all homeowners, a violation of their own policies. The bylaws even included provisions allowing the HOA to hire contractors to forcibly remove non-compliant structures and charge the costs back to the homeowner. What they're doing is technically illegal, my lawyer explained, but we need to gather more evidence before we can prove it in court. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump, convinced the HOA had sent a crew to tear down my barn under the cover of darkness. I checked my security cameras obsessively, expecting to catch someone trespassing. And then, just before midnight, it happened. The cameras caught two individuals sneaking onto my property near the barn. They were dressed in dark clothing and carried what looked like a toolbox. I watched in real time as they approached the barn and began tampering with the locks. My heart raced. Who were these people? HOA contractors? Vandals? I wasn't going to wait to find out. I called the police immediately and explained the situation. To my surprise, officers arrived within minutes, catching the two trespassers in the act. When questioned, they claimed to be HOA maintenance workers sent to inspect the barn for safety violations. They didn't have any credentials or work orders to back up their story, and the police weren't buying it. They were escorted off my property, and the incident was documented as an attempted trespass. The next morning, my lawyer filed an injunction to prevent any unauthorized removal or tampering with the barn. The court granted a temporary order, forcing the HOA to halt all actions against me until the matter was resolved. It was a small victory, but the fight was far from over. A few days later, I received an invitation to a special HOA meeting. The letter claimed the meeting was mandatory for all homeowners in the neighborhood, but I knew it was really about me. Sure enough, when I arrived, the focus of the meeting was my barn. The board president, a stern woman named Linda, wasted no time. "We are here to address the issue of noncompliance," she announced, glaring in my direction. "This homeowner's refusal to follow HOA regulations sets a dangerous precedent for the community." I stood up, refusing to let them paint me as the villain. "I was never properly informed about these regulations," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Your bylaws were passed without homeowner consent, and you've been using intimidation tactics to enforce rules that don't even apply to me." The room erupted into murmurs. Some neighbors looked uncomfortable, clearly torn between supporting the HOA and recognizing the unfairness of the situation. A man in the back raised his hand. "Why are we spending so much time and money going after this one barn? It's not hurting anyone." Linda's composure faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "The rules are in place for a reason. If we allow one homeowner to ignore them, it undermines the integrity of the entire neighborhood." I shook my head. "This isn't about integrity. This is about control. You're targeting me because I won't join your HOA, and you can't stand the idea of someone living outside your authority." The tension in the room was palpable. Several neighbors began nodding, clearly swayed by my argument. But Linda wasn't ready to give up. She announced that the board would be conducting a formal vote to determine whether my barn should be forcibly removed. "You can't do that," my lawyer interrupted. "We have a court order preventing any action until this matter is resolved legally." Linda's face turned red, and she quickly adjourned the meeting. But I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't over. In the days that followed, the HOA's behavior became even more erratic. Surveillance intensified, with officers showing up at all hours to inspect the barn from the street. I even caught one of them peeking over my fence with a pair of binoculars. And then, the most outrageous thing happened. A police officer showed up at my door, holding a report filed by the HOA. They accused me of constructing a hazardous structure that posed a safety risk to the community. The officer was polite but firm, explaining that they were required to investigate. I invited him to inspect the barn, and after a thorough walkthrough, he admitted there was nothing wrong with it. "Honestly, this seems more like a civil dispute," he said, shaking his head. "I'll file the report, but I don't see any criminal issues here." It was clear the HOA was grasping at straws, trying to use any means necessary to assert their power. But instead of intimidating me, their desperation only fueled my determination to fight back. I wasn't going to let them bully me out of my rights. This was my property, my barn, and my life, and I was ready to defend all three. The next morning, I woke to find a new notice taped to my front door. It was another official-looking letter from the HOA, this time declaring my barn a community hazard that required immediate removal. The language was sharper, almost threatening, and it included a hefty fine for continued noncompliance. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. My barn, a solid, well-maintained structure, was now being branded as a danger to the community. It was clear they were running out of excuses. I decided it was time to get proactive. With my lawyer's guidance, I began gathering every piece of evidence I could to strengthen my case. I pulled together property records, documentation of the barn's construction permits, and even a recent inspection report proving the structure was safe. My lawyer assured me that we were building an airtight defense, but I knew this was about more than legalities. The HOA wanted to make an example of me, and I wasn't going to let them. That afternoon, I noticed a few neighbors standing at the edge of my property, whispering among themselves. I approached them cautiously, unsure of what to expect. To my surprise, one of them spoke up, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, we don't agree with what the HOA is doing," she said. "Linda's been telling everyone your barn is some sort of eyesore, but honestly, we don't see the problem. It's your land." Her words caught me off guard. For the first time, I realized not everyone in the neighborhood was against me. In fact, some of them were just as frustrated with the HOA's overreach. Encouraged by this small show of support, I decided to reach out to more neighbors to see where they stood. Over the next few days, I went door to door, sharing my story and explaining how the HOA had targeted me. To my surprise, many of them were sympathetic. A few even admitted they'd been bullied by the HOA in the past, but were too afraid to speak up. It became clear that the HOA's tactics weren't just about enforcing rules. They were about maintaining control through fear. As the support from my neighbors grew, so did the tension with the HOA. Linda and her team weren't happy about my efforts to rally the community. One evening, I caught her standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed and glaring in my direction. She didn't say a word, but the look on her face was enough to send a clear message: back down. But I didn't. Instead, I took things a step further. I posted my story on social media, detailing every incident, from the trespassing attempts to the bogus fines and the intimidation tactics. I included security footage, copies of the letters, and even the police report clearing my barn of any safety violations. The post quickly gained traction, with neighbors and even people from outside the community chiming in to show their support. The next day, I received a call from a local news station. They were interested in covering my story as part of a segment on HOA abuse. At first, I hesitated. Did I really want to go public with this? But after everything I'd been through, I realized this was an opportunity to expose the HOA's behavior on a larger scale. The news crew arrived later that week, setting up cameras in front of my barn. I shared my story with them, being careful to stick to the facts while highlighting the lengths the HOA had gone to harass me. They even interviewed a few supportive neighbors who were willing to speak on camera about their own experiences with the HOA. By the time the segment aired, it was clear the tide was turning. Linda wasn't happy. The very next day, I received yet another letter from the HOA, this time accusing me of defamation and threatening legal action if I didn't remove my social media post and issue a public apology. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer, who laughed out loud when he read it. "This is nothing but a scare tactic," he said. "They know they're losing, and they're trying to save face. Don't let them intimidate you." I didn't. Instead, I doubled down. I updated my post with even more evidence, including screenshots of the latest letter. The community rallied around me, with people flooding the HOA's social media pages with comments demanding accountability. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear Linda and her board were feeling the heat. But the HOA wasn't done yet. One evening, as I was reviewing security footage, I noticed something strange. A group of people gathered near my barn after dark. They appeared to be measuring the structure and taking notes. I immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, the group had vanished. The incident left me shaken. What were they planning? The answer came the following morning in the form of yet another notice. This one claiming the HOA had hired contractors to address the hazard on my property. The language was vague, but the intent was clear. They were planning to tear down my barn, court order or not. I called my lawyer in a panic, and he sprang into action, filing an emergency motion to reinforce the injunction. The judge granted it, warning the HOA that any attempt to remove the barn would result in severe penalties. It was a small but crucial victory, and it gave me the breathing room I needed to regroup. By now, the battle had become bigger than just me and my barn. It was about standing up to an organization that had overstepped its bounds for far too long. The community was watching, and I was determined to see this through to the end. The next few days after the emergency motion felt like a calm before the storm. The court's warning seemed to have forced the HOA to take a step back, at least temporarily. Linda's usual tactics, letters, notices, and her so-called HOA cops, were conspicuously absent. It was eerie, but I knew better than to let my guard down. The HOA wasn't the type to back off without a fight. The quiet was shattered one evening when I returned home from running errands to find a crew of workers near the barn. They were unloading tools and equipment, their truck emblazoned with the logo of a local construction company. My heart raced as I marched over, demanding to know what they were doing. "We were hired by the HOA," one of them said, holding a clipboard. "We're here to evaluate the structure for demolition." Demolition? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The audacity of the HOA to continue their harassment, even after the court's warning, was staggering. "This is private property, and that barn isn't going anywhere," I snapped. "Leave now, or I'll call the police." The workers exchanged uneasy glances before retreating to their truck. I took photos of them and their vehicle as they left, determined to document every instance of the HOA's overreach. As soon as they were gone, I called my lawyer, who was just as outraged as I was. "They're blatantly ignoring the court's order," he said. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we need to escalate this further." The following morning, I attended a neighborhood meeting that a group of concerned residents had organized. To my surprise, it wasn't an HOA meeting, but a gathering of people fed up with Linda's leadership. They had seen my story on the news and social media, and many of them had their own grievances to share. One elderly man recounted how Linda had fined him for having unapproved flowers in his front yard. Another woman spoke about receiving notices for parking her car too close to the curb, even though it was perfectly legal. It became clear that Linda's reign of terror extended far beyond my barn. "We need to do something about this," one neighbor said. "This isn't just about one barn or one person. It's about standing up to an HOA that's gone out of control." The group decided to draft a petition to remove Linda as president, citing her misuse of funds and her overreach in targeting residents. They also planned to bring their concerns to the next official HOA meeting, demanding accountability from the entire board. While the petition was a step in the right direction, I knew it wouldn't be enough to stop Linda from coming after me. That night, I went over every piece of evidence I had gathered, the letters, the photos, the security footage, and compiled it into a detailed report for my lawyer. If the HOA wanted a war, I was ready to fight. A week later, the official HOA meeting arrived, and tensions were high. The room was packed, with standing room-only space filled by angry residents. Linda sat at the head of the table, her usual smug demeanor replaced with a thinly veiled annoyance. It was clear she knew what was coming. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and laid out everything: the harassment, the bogus fines, the attempt to demolish my barn, and the crew they had sent in blatant violation of the court order. I presented security footage, letters, and even testimony from neighbors who had seen Linda trespassing on my property. "This isn't about community safety or standards," I said, my voice steady despite the tension in the room. "This is about power. Linda has used her position to target me and others, not to protect the neighborhood, but to enforce her own agenda. This isn't leadership, it's abuse." The room erupted into murmurs, and several neighbors voiced their agreement. Linda, clearly rattled, tried to regain control. "That barn is a liability," she said, her voice shaky. "It's a hazard to the community, and we have every right to enforce our rules." "That's a lie," I shot back. "I have permits, inspection reports, and a court order protecting my property. What you've done isn't enforcement, it's harassment." The back and forth grew heated, with more residents stepping forward to share their own stories of Linda's overreach. By the end of the meeting, the board was forced to address the growing unrest. A vote was called to remove Linda as president, and to everyone's relief, the majority sided against her. As the meeting ended, Linda stormed out, but not before shooting me a glare that promised this wasn't over. I didn't care. For the first time in months, it felt like the community was on my side. But Linda wasn't one to go quietly. The very next morning, I found a vandalized sign in front of my barn that read, "Community Menace." It was a petty act, but it only fueled my determination. I reported it to the police, adding it to the growing file of evidence against her. A few weeks later, the court ruled in my favor, issuing a permanent injunction that barred the HOA from targeting me or my property again. The judge's ruling was clear. My barn was legal, safe, and none of their business. Furthermore, Linda was personally fined for her repeated violations of the court's orders. With Linda removed from power and the court ruling in my favor, the harassment finally stopped. The neighborhood felt like a different place, calmer, more unified. The barn stood as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that standing up to overreach and bullying was worth the fight. As I stood in front of it one evening, watching the sunset, I felt a deep sense of peace. The barn wasn't just a structure. It was a testament to my determination to protect what was mine. And no one, not even an overzealous HOA, could take that away.